Hi, Eugene.
Hey, Ariella, how are you? Good seeing you.
We were just talking about the issue of a language in first in the Web3 space and then in the science space, and how it can be quite hard for people who don't speak English. But I'll turn it back over to the moderator.
Yeah, seems like we're waiting for one more person for the panel to officially start. There's also Josh from DeSci World, but it seems like we don't have Josh here yet. So maybe we could start or continue the conversations we already had, Ariella, until Josh comes, but I'm not sure where Josh is at the moment. So I'd say if there's something on your minds you want to discuss, especially given this conversation earlier, make sure feel free to open this up again.
Well, I want to give, maybe while we're waiting, we can give Eugene a chance to introduce himself. I've already done so because I was the previous talk, but just the super 30-second recap is I'm an MD PhD candidate. I fell into the Web3 rabbit hole about 9 months ago when I was recruited as a science writer and illustrator to a biotech investment DAO. And now, just very, very recently, I've launched an organization, Web3 Women in Science, which is extremely literally named, so it should be obvious, but it's for women in science who want to get into or are already in the Web3 crypto blockchain space, so that we can both recruit women to the space and support women in all ways once they get there. And I'll turn it over to Eugene.
Yeah, thank you, Ariella, and thank you for the work that you're doing. Because yeah, I mean, segueing slightly to the previous question that was being brought up, right? Science and Web3 are both very male-dominated, white-dominated, English-dominated, etc. So thinking of all the different pathways to make sure it's actually more globally representative is very important, both for Web3 and for DeSci specifically, which has the negative of both pulling from Web3, which has its diversity problems, and from science, which has a ton of diversity problems. So it's a doubly bad starting point there. But
yeah, I call it underrepresentation squared.
Yeah, that's sadly a very appropriate name there. But yeah, to give a quick intro on my side. So hi, everyone. I'm Eugene Leventhal. I am the head of operations and outreach at the Smart Contract Research Forum, or SCRF. If anyone was checking in the stream yesterday, I was presenting on decentralized research centers and some of the work that we do. So I won't belabor in too much detail. Feel free to check that one if you want to learn a little bit more about the nuances of what we're working on. But in short, we're grant funded. We don't monetize. We're not tokenizing. We're not doing any of that. We get grant fundings and we use that money to either hire people to build the operational infrastructure to bring together more research networks to help advance Web3 research, or we're trying to directly deploy that funding to researchers themselves to kind of fill the gap in some funding needs that they have. We're not trying to be a multi-million-dollar funding agency. I mean, we're grant funded. We don't have that kind of runway. And our goal is not to do research ourselves. Our name is a little misleading. Smart Contract Research Forum sounds like we are ourselves researching smart contracts and putting it on a forum. Really, only the forum part of that is on point. Everything else is slightly misleading there. Smart contracts is one of the many topics that we cover. We just care about anything Web3. But I personally fell down, and hey, Josh, I personally fell down the Web3 rabbit hole back in early 2016 and worked on a DAO project to try to help focus on community crowdfunding for local communities in New York City, where I was at the time. And suffice it to say, little too early to be building DAOs, no tooling around then. But yeah, happy to share about any of that more as it makes sense. But I know Josh just hopped in, so I'll pass it off to Josh to do an intro.
Hey, Eugene, thank you. So yeah, hi, my name is Joshua. I'm the founder of DeSci World. DeSci World is a community infrastructure platform for the growing space of DeSci. I'm super stoked to be here. A little bit about myself. I've kind of been doing, like Eugene, DAOs for a couple of years now. Not quite as long as Eugene though. Not quite as OG as that. But so I typically actually come from DeFi. I've worked on a few DeFi DAOs. I worked on the Assange DAO. I was quite influential on that. But yeah, I'm laying my hat on DeSci at the moment because I think it's probably the most important space, coupled with DAOs. The conjunction between DAOs and DeSci should be a catalyst for change over the next 5 to 10 years.
Great. Thank you all for being here. Now we can officially start this DeSci panel in Metafest 2. And I want to open up this conversation by going fundamental, by asking each of you, what do you think is the need for DeSci at this specific moment in time? And, and what are the problems that you maybe probably faced, maybe personally, that motivate you to be in this space, either build, either communicate, either share the word around, and what makes it a necessity in terms of uh, life experience. I would like to know what's behind. So everybody who is an answer ready can go on.
Yeah, sure. I don't mind starting.
Of course.
Yeah, cool. So, I mean, look, DeSci is decentralizing science, right? And science is a huge, huge field with many, many applications. It means a lot of things to a lot of different people. Science isn't just the experiments that we do and the products that we make. It's the way we sort of understand and learn about the world around us. So, decentralizing science covers basically everything. If you want to, it can cover pretty much anything. But to me, what decentralizing science means is like essentially bringing science back to its sort of original purpose, which was this pursuit of like the natural truth, right? It's the world around us. We're trying to understand it. We're beginning to understand it like more than ever before in history, depending on which historians you ask. And the gains of this science are accumulating in a sort of corporate capitalist fashion, which makes sense for efficiency, makes sense for the world we live in right now. But there's a lot of problems with that. There's a problem with the incentives for scientists, the incentives for people to get science produced, funded, and whatnot. Um, the idea of DeSci, to me, is to sort of break down those corporate barriers and sort of return the power of science back to what it was meant to be, which is to sort of understand and discover the world around us. If that helps scientists in the process, if that helps people in the process, then fantastic. But this kind of marriage at the moment between science and corporatism is a bit of a it's a bit of a gross thing. So the quicker we get rid of that, the better, in my opinion.
Awesome. Yeah, and it seems like today, especially, we've had a more nuanced, critical conversation about these issues. We had some people who either identify as being in the left or are enacting policies or ways of thinking or building in a way that tries to bring a more equitable future or present, given how saturated our world has been from this big techno-feudalist kind of Lovecraftian monster that has been on top of the way we've built organizations traditionally. So it's nice to see this convergence of topics. And I would like to hear you, Eugene, or you, Ariella, and what your motivations are. Okay, I'll give it to you, Ariella.
Oh, no, I said Eugene can go first because I was just.
Oh, all right.
But then I'll go after.
Okay. Sounds good. So yeah, I mean, right, I guess the initial question was kind of getting at like, what is DeSci and what problem is being solved? And I think there's a lot of different ways to take that question. I very much hear Josh's response. And I think, right, a different angle is also in the time and point in history and the other momentums of trying to adjust this. And where does Web3 fit in, right? Because DeSci should not be looked at as this brand spanking new thing of like, whoa, we just started thinking about how to improve science. That's nuts. It's like, well, no, people have been doing that for a really long time, and we shouldn't neglect them or forget about them just because they might actually not care about Web3, but actually look at it very negatively. And so there's a whole element of the DeSci community. And I know I've spoken with both Ariella and Josh about this offline of like, well, what are the pathways to have these honest discussions and not pretend that we know the solutions as well? And that's where my own view, and this is actually came up in a conversation offline yesterday too, but the idea of like, we're kind of now with DeSci with what DeFi was in 2016, 17. Like, we are years away from really understanding product market fit, models that actually work, applicability of what's happening, but there's so much energy and momentum. There's so many folks, and I think Ariella is much closer to this than Josh and I myself, given that she's actually in the world of science and going through, medical PhD programs, et cetera, right? I know so many folks in that PhD track who are so upset and disenfranchised and just like, this was supposed to be the most intellectually fulfilling 5 to 7 years of my life. And it was in certain ways, but it was also the most soul sucking. And like, it totally left me devoid of like where this actually leads. And so I think for now, at least from my own perspective, and like what I really want to contribute to is just being like, hey, open scientists, hey, non-Web3 scientists, I'm not here to shill you or sell you a vision that may or may not be true. I just want to say that like, there's a new camp of people who want to fight the good fight with you, and let's all link arms and do it together, because that actually maximizes our chance of solving these massive problems. And as Josh alluded to, the problems of knowledge, right? These aren't like minuscule, like, how do you tweak that a little better? Or how do you like A/B test the design features? Like, how do we as a species do knowledge better? And like, that is a huge problem that I don't think any one group will ever solve. Like, we all have to work together. So for me, the biggest problem right now is how to maximize the binding forces between anyone thinking about these problems. Because and especially recognizing the bear market, because the sad reality is, folks like Jocelyn Pearl and Danny Lee and some others put together this great graphic on the DeSci space. Sad reality, 90% of us aren't going to be around in 3 years, thanks to the economic market we're turning it to, right? So how do we actually maximize that we are all working towards an end goal and not towards our own egos? And for me, like, that is the biggest problem right now for us.
These are both such great answers. Yeah, I think it's a good transition to me when you were talking about the soul-sucking PhD. That is currently where I'm at. Like I said, I've sold my soul to and at least 8 years in the combined MD PhD program. So I'm experiencing training on both those fronts at the same time. I'm at the midpoint, which is traditionally where everyone gets super jaded and like apathetic and kind of hates everything, and I am no exception, unfortunately. It is really hard, and I think that we're all on the same page, which is, we might not be able to say for certain what the solutions are going to be, but I think we can all say for certain that there are definitely problems, So there's that saying, don't fix what ain't broke. I think science and medicine is very broken right now, and it's becoming very obvious. And I think a lot of the contributing factors are that we're basing everything on extremely archaic models. So for scientific publishing, we're largely using the same systems that have been used since literally the 1800s, and nobody has decided that maybe we should do things differently now because, the internet. And I think Eugene's point also about how DeSci is not inventing open science is a good one. We're standing on the shoulders of the progress the open science movement has been making, and the rise of things like preprint servers for scientific publishing, which is removing these ridiculous barriers to publishing your research, being the totally subjective gatekeepers that are these for-profit journals that somehow walk away with all of the profit, despite the fact that they did none of the work. Literally, they didn't do the science. That's the researcher. They didn't write the paper. That's the researcher. And they didn't review the paper for accuracy. That's the peer reviewers that they basically force to do volunteer labor for them so that they can build a good relationship with the journal so they can publish. It's an absurd system. And then grant funding is also an absurd system. I naively assumed that when you write a grant, that then after you get the money, you do what you said you were going to do in the grant, and that there'd be some kind of accountability. And then I got here and everyone's like, oh yeah, just write this. And I'm like, well, I'm not going to do that. And they're saying, but it sounds better. And nobody checks. Pretty much nobody does what they say they're going to do in the grant. And I was thinking, this is just mind blowing. Like, this is completely normal. You walk into this with idealized thinking, you know, oh, science is going to be done systematically. You're going to publish all of your results, even negative results. You're going to apply for funding in a very logical, objective way. None of that is true. Everything is terrible. and last thing, because I don't want to ramble too long, from the patient side as well, both medical student and a patient. I have chronic illnesses. I'm in the hospital quite frequently, and I'm part of organizations like Crowdfunded Cures trying to overturn the patent model, which is also ridiculous. You would think that the driving force for developing new therapies would be whether they work. That's not the driving force at all. The driving force is how much money you can make off of them. So those misaligned incentives mean that if you want to make a drug that would be a drug or some kind of nutraceutical or any kind of intervention, and you want to get it through trials because you really think that it's going to help people, if you can't get a patent on it to raise money from, you know, a pharma company or an investors, it's never going to happen. That's not what people care about. And on the flip side, you can create you can take an existing drug that's already profitable, try to tweak one molecule that maybe makes it a tiny bit better, maybe it doesn't, but you can hype it up as if it does, file a new patent, and then try to get everyone to prescribe that, which does work, even though it's the same as the old drug, which is now off patent and available for 100 times cheaper. But everything, especially in the United States, is part of this medical, pharma, industrial complex. And it sounds like a conspiracy, but it's not a conspiracy theory. This is literally just the status quo of how everything works. Okay, I'll stop my rant now, but the point is, there are huge problems on all sides, and I don't know the solution, but I think that Web3 has the potential to provide the tools that would be needed to surmount what has seemed to be insurmountable levels of problems and crises. You know, it's been really hard to get over all of this this inertia that we've had for these archaic systems, and maybe this is the kind of revolutionary spark that we need to actually make a difference. I haven't seen anything else that seems like it could have it. So I don't know whether it will work, but it's the best chance that I've seen, in my opinion. That's my rant.
Amen. Well, yeah. And you have seen it with your own eyes. You have experienced the problems. And for example, I will also be a PhD candidate, and I am very worried. I'm very concerned. You know. Exactly. To some people, it sounds like, whoa, it's amazing, you know. But I'm like, I know what I'm getting to. I know the trade-offs. I know the sacrifices, because there are sacrifices. And I haven't even experienced the full extent of them, because there's also the psychological issue of this soul-crushing thing that you have been explaining, trying to explain to us. Yeah, I'm not sure about this at all, and this seems to be a driving force for a lot of people in DeSci, this dissatisfaction with how academia works, with the status quo inside academia, in STEM, and in the sciences in general. I mean, I come from a more humanities background, although it was about science always, and I've studied also science. I've studied cognitive science, but still, I haven't felt this pressure of being in a lab, trying to figure out how this new machine that nobody else knows how to works, and being the last name in a publication, and thinking this is success, and your career is moving forward. So I think these are foundational issues that people in DeSci are trying to basically escape, and it's very interesting to see this experimentation, this newfound creativity that was also always a part of science, which we seem to have forgot how important it is, and settled for incremental progress rather than more, we could say, like Thomas Kuhn would say, a revolutionary science and a scientific revolution. And I think that if a scientific revolution is to come out of somewhere, I think it would probably come out of DeSci and this experimentation in terms of form, in terms of the methods, in terms of mindset also. This could also, yes, Joshua, you wanted to comment?
Yeah, I just wanted to touch on what Ariella said about, I can't remember the exact word you used. It wasn't inertia. It was the blockers, right? The fact that there's these blockers in that basically we're not changing the way things have been done since the 1800s. You just mentioned it, that we're doing this incremental change. Like, incremental change has kind of been the form for the longest while. You know, incremental change is fine, change is good, but we kind of got to this point where incremental change has continued and halted for about, arguably for about 45 years since the 70s. A lot of stuff happened in the 70s that basically just stopped the progress that we were having in many fronts, just stopped or reversed and went in a negative direction. And that's across not just science, most of what makes humanity right now: finance, science, politics, all of it, birth rates, you look at it. The same thing happens in science, right? And it is, in my opinion, not something that just happened randomly, and it's not something that can randomly unfix itself. It is a structural choice to stall like this, to keep, as Ariella said, what about the internet? Well, now that the technology for the internet actually exists, the change that the internet can do is so revolutionary, right? Things had to remain the same. The power had to be controlled. The power had to remain concrete, because the change, when the real change from the internet and the people was allowed to run free, it would just get out of control, and the power structures would just cease to exist. So we are in this sort of moment where 50 years ago, it was decided that we're going to stall. Society is going to stall. All the gains that we continue to make are going to continue to accrue to a small amount of people across the whole of society, and it's the same in science. And we need to, unclog that drain, for example. The pressure is building on the other side. It's been building for 50 years. We're still stuck with this clogged drain. Second we release it, poosh, can you imagine? That's the scientific revolution that you're expecting, right? And yeah, I just sort of wanted to jump in there because you both mentioned it. And I just kind of want to make the point from my personal point of view, that this is not just something passive that just happened. This is an active effort from our end to decentralize, but an active effort from the other end to maintain that status quo. So I just thought it was quite important to say.
I agree. And I want to also say, I think it's this interesting interaction between, we have these new Web3 technologies that are rising, and at the same time, we have this dissatisfaction, which is quite the euphemism for the emotions I've been seeing, this dissatisfaction that has been peaking as well. I think we're reaching a breaking point. And you can see that if you kind of observe trends in academic Twitter and other social media. I see people daily, established professors even posting screenshots of where they've said they've responded to requests for peer review for scientific publication and saying, my consulting fee is $200 an hour, pay me or get lost, and that would be unheard of before. Just people are just done with it, done with being taken advantage of. And then on the pharma R&D side, you look at the graphs of the cost to bring a drug to market, and the graph is like this, and we've hit a point where it's a breaking point. Like, it just can't keep continuing like this. It's unsustainable, and something is going to need to change in the systems that we are using to do this. It can't keep going the way it's going. So I think the rise of both those trends at the same time are making a perfect storm for DeSci to maybe step in and time it right and do the revolution correctly. Because what we don't want is to just say, like, no more journals, no more science. like, no, we don't want that. There needs to be some sort of creation. But I think that the timing might actually work out really well here if we can play it right, recruit the right people, keep the incentives aligned. And it's really heartening to be on panels like this. I'm quite fond of both Eugene and Josh and their ideas. And so it's really nice to hear from fellow community members and be on the same page about this. And I'll be following their work very, very closely to see everything they're doing as well. And I actually have to run because I have to get to a meeting in 5 minutes in person. So I'm going to have to ride one of those little scooters. But thank you so much for having me, and I'm going to let you guys continue the conversation without my further ramblings. So,
Bye, Ariella.
No ramblings at all. Thank you for the additions, Ariella. Great seeing you.
Great seeing you. Bye.
Thank you for being here, Ariella. Your perspective has been very enlightening.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
And just to build on what Ariella was just mentioning, I know one thing that I've generally been thinking about, and I think Josh, you brought this up with sort of the internet parallels and how that was going. And especially, I don't know how many folks are, like tech history nerds here, but if you look at the actual like cypherpunk movements in the beginning of cryptography, and, there was like the government run cryptography, and there was like these rogue scientists who were like, no, cryptography is for the people. And, like put in a rogue scientist, they were at IBM and massive corporates, but like they kept pushing it through, and there was like a battle between corporate and government, like fascinating history. But anyway, if you look at like the actual like cultural boards, and this is pre-public internet, so like TCP/IP based boards in like the 80s and whatnot, like all the cypherpunk mailing lists and everything. And then you look at what happened via the tech boom, right? It's insane how disparately far away from each other they are. And what this last boom cycle, let's call it starting at DeFi summer, which was summer 2020 for those who are still very new to crypto, all the way through now what I am personally expecting to be one of the worst economic situations that the world has seen in the last century, right? Forget about crypto specifically. I think that what's happened in the last 2 years perfectly paralleled the internet, where like there's been so many groups and I got so many people pitching me, and I'm like, oh, so you're just recreating all of the problems in society on a blockchain. And like, you think just because it's on chain that, we can just recreate all the same incentive structures around capitalism, and especially people from like the corporate angle of just like, oh no, well, we just don't want to miss out on this financial opportunity. So we literally want to do our thing on a chain. And it's easy to just point of like, oh, well, look at those enterprises and they're the bad guy and they're trying, right? But then if you actually delve into the world of governance research and realize that while cooperative structures have been around for millennia in some shape or form, we are still, our knowledge and experimentation relative to what we need to confidently say of like, here's a model that works in this context for this kind of solution is not great yet. And like, we still have so much room for improvement. And that's why I think that any Web3 application domain, DeSci, DeFi, whatever you want to put in there, we still need so many years of focused learning on governance and tokenomics and incentives, because as of right now, I don't know if anyone here listens to either Richard Wolff or Lex Friedman's podcast, but Richard Wolff, who's a Marxian economist, was just on Lex Friedman's podcast. And I just thought he had a couple of articulations that really got to the point of like, are we just letting the same problems creep into Web3 because so many of us who are building, and I work at a public goods, like we're not monetizing, but like it's only even 1,000-fold when you're at a place with a token where you want it to go to the moon. And even if you're in it for the right reasons, you check your account frequently, right? Like I get those impulses, and like we all inevitably play that way because we are confined to our living meat sacks, and we have basic needs of jobs and foods and all that kind of stuff. So I don't know, it's a thing that's just been much more on top of my mind, both for DeSci specifically, but also for all of Web3. Like, are we doing enough of a good job keeping ourselves critically honest to ensure that we're not like, let's delay how quickly it happens, but make sure we do it right, as opposed to let's just rush to solutions, and then the wrong one can end up being the billion-dollar solution, right? And then we can just lose control of it, and the mainstream is still all the same problems, just on chain, and it's these tiny pockets of like, but that wasn't the point. We wanted to do it different. And it's like, but who cares? It's a $10 trillion industry already. So like that, and I actually think the bear market right now is the right. I'm actually weirdly thankful for it, because I think it's going to push out most of the noise and the garbage, and it's going to leave the people who ideologically want to see the world change and are willing to put in the time and energy to try to build the systems for that.
Can I jump in?
Yeah, of course, you really can.
Yeah, so like, firstly, I completely agree that the bear market right now is a great time. As Ariella said, for DeSci, it's a good opportunity for DeSci to do its thing and try and make a statement in this sort of this particular period. I'm a little bit more optimistic in the adoption rates of crypto during the bear market. I think the prices are going to go through the floor, but I think that actually might serve crypto better in a sense. People might use it more. But yeah, this point of like, we're building this inner society, right? This entire decentralized landscape is born out of this society. So that, like, everything we build is going to be a parallel of what's already built. You know, so Sam and FTX have already bailed out half of the biggest lenders that cocked up. You know, Ariella was saying about how certain patents can be sort of slightly changed and then redeployed. Well, we've been doing that with 35 Olympus DAO forks, and every time something new comes out, there's like 20 forks of it, and people still buy it. So this is going to be the case, in my opinion, for the whole period, right? There's just got to be this core that is willing to build despite the noise, is willing to contribute and make these mistakes. And Eugene, like, the Smart Contract Research Forum is going to be, hopefully, I expect, like a core thing for making this actually viable on a large scale, on a nation state scale, if you want to take it that far, right? And this is what we need to do, is that we need to be in this situation to do these experiments. We need to have, okay, fine, if someone wants to do their altruistic investing and go and get a bunch of money from the market and come back and do it in an altruistic way, great, but we can't rely on those people, right? So we've got to build these things by ourselves. And I personally don't get too upset about the bullshit around, because it's going to be there, right? It's just, we've got to do what we know to be right, and try and get that keep going. But yeah.
All right, and Eugene, since Joshua gave the shout out to Scurf, don't feel too humble to say about how Scurf will fit into this and how it solves these problems.
Yeah, and I will never be using such terms as solves, because we are running experiments to
solves.
see. Yeah,
yeah, solves are yeah.
That is for a more
Qualifiers.
overly confident personality than my own. Terms like solves make my insides start quivering of like, I don't have the future vision to say such things. But no, I get what you're saying though. And so from our perspective, right, like the way we're thinking about Scurf, right, what is the goal of Scurf? What is our mission? Our mission is to advance Web3 research, right? Super specific. I'm sure no one's ever heard of something such a mission, right? So it's like, well, what does that actually mean? How do you operationalize something like advancing a topic or advancing knowledge? Like, what does that even mean? Because what does it mean to advance? What is knowledge, right? Like, you could get real philosophical about all this real quick. But at the end of the day, for Web3, there's people producing knowledge, and then there's people building. And as of right now, they're much more siloed than they need to be, right? At the end of the day, our starting point was that people building frequently don't hear about research that is hyper relevant to their domain area. And anyone who's been in DAOs for more than the last few months probably recognizes, especially if you knew what a co-op was before you show up at a DAO, of like, aren't you just telling me about what a co-op is, just with a fancy blockchain thing that I don't really understand? And when you said that in 2016, the frequent response was, WTF is a co-op. And right, like, that shows a huge gap. So in our mind, how do we keep closing these kinds of gaps? And so we're not starting with like, how do we solve like the most audacious problems? Because we still haven't structurally figured out how to solve what seems like relatively easy problems of, here's knowledge, these people need it, how do we get it across? And like, how do you actually systematically do that? And kind of shockingly, outside of single enterprises, right? Like, Google has their version of how they do this. Facebook has their version of how they do, right? Companies that build up massive global R&D apparatuses kind of do this internally. They don't open source it. They don't share it. That's that, in their view, that's their proprietary advantage for how they conduct R&D, which can lead to the next breakthrough, which is the next trillion, billion, whatever dollar thing. And right, like, they are playing the VC game. They exist to supposedly to make money for their shareholders and advance on that side. So why I think, and sort of what I am trying to push towards with Scurf, and I feel insanely privileged to be at a place like Scurf where we all want to go on this journey together, is that we want to fight the public goods fight, the non-monetized, non-tokenized public goods fight, right? Because it is still unclear if we truly work towards chipping away at and changing culture and norms, how wide does philanthropic giving actually get? And I am unconvinced that it is a meaningless amount. I actually think that figuring out what is the upper bound on philanthropic giving, and simultaneously, as people are building Web3 tooling, thinking, how do I minimize the barriers to give money to the causes that I support, right? Every time I transact in MetaMask, why can't I give a fraction of a penny to Gitcoin, right? And like contribute to their matching fund? Why doesn't every single wallet have that? Right? Why doesn't it? And I know now there are actually some ecosystems. Oh man, I'm forgetting the name of this one. That would be a shame I can't plug them. But like there's one chain that's actually launching, and they're embedding into their protocol that every time a transaction happens, a percentage is kicked off to a public goods fund that the community can then decide what to fund with once a quarter. So there's so many steps that we could take in the direction of just maximizing the amount of experimentation that's happening. And our whole approach, right? Scurf, we have our forum, we have our community, we're doing a peer review experiment where we're paying reviewers to review papers for independent researchers, so not pushing to a journal or a conference. We have our decentralized research centers. We're trying to go super deep and bring together all of the relevant topics around single domain areas. And UniPuff also we're collaborating on that side as well, so can talk people's ear off on that, but don't want to monopolize here. But right, we're just trying to think, and especially reading David Ehrlichman's Impact Networks, and a bit of a shameless plug, we're going to have him in our community call next week talking about impact networks in the context of research as a public good. That book really helped me frame to think about, right? Humans are inherently social, and right, it's all about coordination, right? I love that the boiling down that the Gitcoin crew frequently does, because I agree with that to a degree. Like, what separates humans? It's the coordination. Well, if we coordinate, that means we're doing it with other people. If we're doing it with other people, that means we're in networks. So if we naturally organize into networks, we have to better understand what are the emergent networks versus the artificially created networks, and how do you create a right culture and operational layer across what's there and start filling in the gaps of what's missing. And so, right, I didn't have this language and thinking 3 months ago. So like the speed with which this evolves, and that like we all need to be, right, again, with the binding culture, like getting to talk to Josh and to Uni and to Ariella and to everyone else, and one-on-ones and group convenings and conference, right? Like this is all such an amazing mind meld. And one of the big open questions is like, we're having this great panel today, that gets lost today besides anyone who watches the stream. So what's the layer of incentives that we can create on existing events to capture the discussions of those events on a place like Scurf, so that if you're, let's say you just heard this panel and you're like, hey, that was super cool, I'd actually love to write a blog post about it. What if there was a big structure like that for every Web3 conference? Like that's something we want to explore in the future. And like, how can we create more capture of existing knowledge, and then the methods of sharing those? But I'll stop there.
Oh, that was an amazing speed run of so many great ideas. I don't know where to start. It's a lot to unpack, but it seems that the thread behind all that is this public goods infrastructure that is that innovation is focusing on that right now. And it seems like science is the most relevant, maybe, human activity to actually apply it to, because it was the OG public good from the times of Francis Bacon and George Boyle and the empiricists who tried to open up the method of sciences and take it up from the alchemists who wanted to enclose it into this weird language. Like from the history of modern science, as it started in the 17th, 18th century, it has been this battle to open up knowledge. And so it seems to have also been inside the fundamental philosophy of the cypherpunks and the open source movement that took from this long history of science and opening up knowledge. But it seems like if there's one thing that especially needs this public goods infrastructure, it is science. And I don't know when we will have a more established presence in science, and if there's gonna be strong enough bridges between academia and this emerging territory of decentralized research centers. And maybe this can be the topic that we can segue into next, this breeds and how to practically build it.
Can I go?
Yeah, of course.
Sure. So, I mean, okay, if we're talking decentralized research centers in the sense of like a physical laboratory or something like that, that's a really, really awesome idea. But I think we'll leave the sort of physical decentralized research centers to another discussion because it's a big thing in itself.
Of course.
So, for example, DeSci World, right? We're trying to build this sort of community infrastructure platform for the DeSci space, and like it's again, it's the DeSci space is brand new, right? So we're all sort of like trying to figure out where we're best placed, where we're most useful, where we should put our hat and contribute to the actual general elevation of this whole space. But for example, for DeSci World, what we're trying to do, right, is we're trying to basically provide an opportunity for people who want to do science, right? To basically remove most of these, in my opinion, somewhat arbitrary barriers, at least to getting involved. Obviously, when you start doing sort of experimentation or you're starting to produce products or pharmaceuticals or whatever, you have to have a level of expertise, otherwise you're going to mess it up and people will get hurt. Right? That's obviously unacceptable. But before that, if you have an interest in something that classifies as chemistry or classifies as biology or classifies as archaeology, right? Unless you're doing those things in your school or in your extracurricular tutorage, you don't really get to experiment in them. And it's these kind of classifications which arguably are arbitrary. Like, I mean, I've had a very interesting conversation with someone about the separation of religion, philosophy, and science. Right? There's three separate subjects as we all grow up to learn, but there is actually like some truth to be had in understanding them as a whole, right? To understand how the soul, the mind, the concept of who we are fits in with this physical reality that we have, right? So these sort of like arbitrary barriers which stop people from getting involved into the science that they want to get involved in or doing the research that they feel is relevant, they need to be pulled down as much, as quickly as possible to allow this, as you said, Francis Bacon trying to open up the open up science to the people. Interesting, you used Francis Bacon as being the person to open up science to the people because it's controversial, but
it is, yeah, of course, yeah.
But yeah, this essentially this is what it is. Science has now been labeled, it has been categorized, it's been dissected, it's been chopped up and put into its little boxes, and that's for a number of reasons. For efficiency in, for example, specialization in your field, that's great. For efficiency in admin, for efficiency in results, great. But people need to feel free to understand the links between all of these different things, the links between different types of research, the links between different types of sciences. And DeSci World is trying to do basically a very early stage of all of that. We're trying to give people the opportunity to basically come along, express their interest, delve into their interest, learn, and actually get rewarded for it, right? So this, as Eugene said, like if you wanted to, you listen to this talk and you want to go and write a blog post, what if there was a place that actually incentivized you to do that? Well, what if you wanted to learn something about a scientific discovery that you just learned and you have no idea about it and you want to get involved in it? Well, you can come along to somewhere like DeSci World, get connected, and maybe be incentivized to actually provide value to this space. So I suppose roundabout back to your point about decentralized research, I think the important thing is access to information and access to opportunities and access to incentives, because without a correct incentive structure, you have to go and slave something else. Without access to information, you're clueless. And without access to the actual research capabilities itself, you can't do it. So, yeah.
Oh, there's so much that there's a whole conversation that can go on forever, I feel. Especially about this issue of how this specific way of opening up science can actually open it up in more ways than just financially or in terms of how we do coordination, but actually opening it up intellectually, because this is also a really big issue that is also, tied with the whole infrastructure that academia already has, which is very siloed. But I want to know Eugene's comments on that. And I would also want to have like a prompt, because we have like 15 minutes more. I don't know how deep we can go with this discussion, to maybe talk about the dangers, the possible dangers of DeSci, of how it can go wrong, which I think is something that we should start talking about early on, just not face them at some point. So Eugene, you have any comment into what Joshua said before, and then we can go into this spicy topic.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree with what Josh was saying, and I know from our perspective, both in terms of stuff that both you and I have spoken about, and just in general, and being excited about what DeSci World is doing, right? When we start these large scale endeavors of understanding knowledge, the importance of mapping what you're actually working with is of a tremendous amount of importance. So I think the fact that one of the aspects of what DeSci World is building, and obviously Joshua, please jump in and correct me if I'm misrepresenting anything at DeSci World, but from my understanding, like one big aspect of it is effectively, like mapping quasi community directory, right? Like incentivize people to want to add to it so that we can actually have a single place to be like, oh snap, there are all the projects. We don't have to guess. We don't have to have some janky spreadsheet that I made that people forget to update and that I forget to tell people, right? Like we can have a real clean product.
That spreadsheet was the beginning of DeSci World, so it wasn't janky. That spreadsheet was the best thing that ever happened to DeSci World.
But it led to something infinitely better than just that spreadsheet, which is the very exciting part. And the other aspect of what they're thinking is, right, like how do you link mapping of knowledge to actual funding of knowledge? And like those are very important, right? And like the way the decentralized research center approach and like the specific way that I'm defining it, right? It's you have to bring together the network of people actually in the middle of doing research or writing about it or whatever, right? The intellectual layer of research review and publication. You have the social layer of people building community around it, media around it, advocating, etc. You have the funding layer, right? Because none of this stuff above it happens without money. And you need ops, because if you don't have a group of people coordinating all of those set activities, then no one ever hears about it, which is a huge complaint that like I used to work at Carnegie Mellon University before I went to SCURF. Talk to almost any high-ranking, whatever, faculty, tenured, whatever, and they will all give the complaint of like, oh, this doesn't have far enough reach, unless they've already broken through a certain parallel where like all of their research hits the radar of Wired and New York Times, right? Like, and it's you have to break a threshold, and it's like, ooh, now you're important enough. We're going to keep an eye on you. But if you haven't hit that threshold yet, then who's actually helping your research get out there? So I'm super excited to see this kind of growing landscape of experimentation, because again, these are hard problems and we don't know the best way to solve them. And that's why it always comes down to me for the binding. And like, I hate even when people look at any DeSci project and then SCURF and then in conversation, like, oh, so they're your competitors. I'm like, no, that is the absolutely wrongest way to think about this. And the whole thing, right? If we are stepping away from that old style thinking into something truly decentralized, we are never competitors. We are all nodes in a massive network that coordinates in a single direction, right? Like we are all part of the solution, or we're not. And if we're not, that's fine. Let's figure out a way to be part of the solution, because not every idea will be part of what works in the future. And so that's where I think, right, even the idea, I forgot where I heard this, but it was the idea of like rethinking rage quitting, right? Because it's like on the one hand, rage quitting is like, oh, you didn't accept me, F you, I'm out, right? Well, what if rage quitting is, hey, I'm really getting a sense there might be a better way to do this. Great, go do that, and you're welcome here if it doesn't go well, right? Like there's a different way to go about it, as opposed to just like all emotions and like explosion and etc. So yeah, that's a big aspect for me, and that's why it keeps coming down to like we just need to like each other as humans and want to work on the same problem, because that maximizes the chance that we are all actually part of the solution and not playing to our egos. But yeah, and I guess the other part was the transition to more the worst case and where DeSci can go wrong, so to say.
I just want to back what you just said then. Collaboration, not competition, is the aim of the game in Web3, in particular in DeSci. I mean, DeFi, there is only a finite, or depending if you ask the Fed, finite amount of money to go around. But yeah, collaboration over competition all the way.
Absolutely.
So, Eugene, I will ask you to repeat that question, because there were some fireworks going on right beside me and got me totally bamboozled.
Yeah, no worries. So just making sure the other question you wanted us to transition to for the last 10 or so minutes was more of what can go wrong and that side of it.
Yeah, let's go into that.
Sure. I mean, I feel like we've already been kind of mentioning one of the biggest things, which is we just put all the wrong incentives on steroids and make a $1 trillion problem a $10 trillion problem. Like that wouldn't exactly be the most helpful outcome. I think the actual, right, I mean, I don't know, it depends on how you define the worst case, because Yeah, I think we're gonna need to dig into some specific use cases, right? Because like the worst case
Yeah.
of a public forum is very different than like, you know, a hardware linked identity solution that links everything and it can right. If like they get flawed, if they're flawed and get hacked, then like so much of your PII gets disclosed. So I think it also matters, yeah, like what do we want to look at any specific use cases to get a little more specific? I don't know, Josh, if you have any ideas.
Yeah, I was wondering if we should choose a use case for each other. Yeah.
Okay,
For the fun.
okay. That could be
Right.
a fun one, yeah. You have
Yeah.
one in mind already? I
Eugene,
gotta think
what's the
about that.
worst thing that can happen to a biotech DAO?
All right. That's a good one. Put me on the spot with a good question.
Well,
What
that's
is
the
the
easiest
worst
one.
case?
You're going to give me one after, so I'm
I know, I gotta both think of which a harder one to give you and an answer to the question that's challenging simultaneously. So in terms of the worst case, right? So let's take biotech DAO. What does that even mean, right? So that means a group of individuals that probably want to, right? DAO. What does that mean? It's a group of people managing a shared resource of some kind with collective decision power over it. So what does that mean in the context of a biotech DAO? That means they're probably investing in, like, they are effectively a decentralized venture capital fund for biotechnology. Is that kind of, am I getting that application?
That's what I'm going for. I mean, the typical model would be the investment DAO. They could potentially produce things in-house, but let's go with the biotech investment DAO.
Cool. So yeah, and I guess, yeah, I'm happy to kind of take both of that, whether it's just like funding external or funding like R&D department and actually managing it. Because I think one of the biggest problems with these structures and sort of the untested waters of decentralization, right? For me, I am the part of decentralization that I get very excited about is how do we embed ego minimization into decentralized systems? Because it's very easy to pretend that, oh, well, there's 4 of us on this call. And let's pretend there's 8 of us on this call. We're all in it together. That means we're all kumbaya and equals and this and that. But maybe I'm the biggest extrovert, so I'm going to talk the most and I'm going to be a little more aggressive in my communication. And then all of a sudden, right, and like there's these natural postures that we fall into. And right, there's our personalities, there's our culture, there's our society, there's cultural conditioning. Like there's so many things that play into that aspect. So for me, a huge concern is like a group of 8 to 10 people who are all drinking the same exact Kool-Aid are telling each other like, yeah, no, that's an awesome idea. Let's keep doing it. And then they like unleash the worst like chemical weapon that they didn't even realize was that. And then someone's like, oh, you just made something that I can go kill 10 million people with available on the internet. And you didn't even see that because you just wanted to see it through rose-colored glasses. So I'm actually worried that like, what are going to be the checks in place to make sure that someone doesn't unintentionally, right? Especially once you start going into like physical lab territory in a decentralized matter, like whatever, I don't want to make this political in any kind of way, but like, right, the idea of stuff leaking out of labs is not an insane thought, right? And how does that measure, who double checks that when there is no government or anyone in place overseeing them specifically, right? So like, what is meaningful self-regulation in a decentralized landscape look like? And I get very worried of barreling to like decentralized R&D before we understand how do we make sure that we don't actually ruin the world with our R&D. And so like, yeah, that's where I get scared, both in terms of like the over enthusiasm of it, as well as the, well, we're just all drinking the same Kool-Aid. And I'll just give one quick definition. I don't know if they're okay with me publicly quoting them. So I'll just say, someone I was chatting with once gave me my favorite definition of what an ideal DAO is, which is 5 people with a shared goal who hate each other's guts. That would be a great DAO because then they will keep each other in check. But because they have a shared goal, they're not going to be total, you know, butts to each other, right? Like they're not just going to make it a miserable environment. It's like, well, we all want to get here and like I don't like you individually and we approach things different, but like we're working toward, right? Like that would theoretically be great. How do we avoid just finding like-minded people who look and sound like us who want to do the same thing? Because then we don't even see the potential problems we're throwing into the world because no one's giving us a different perspective on what we're doing. So yeah, I don't know whether or not that was a good answer, but that was the one I came up with. Now to an application for Josh.
While you think, let me just comment on what you said.
Please.
The fact that we're having this conversation now, right, about what, you know, basically, Eugene, you just described DARPA, right? A bunch of people sat around, pat each other on the back, not worrying about accountability or any fallout, right? So the fact that we're sat here discussing this, it makes me feel already confident that DeSci is not going to go down the same destructive routes that this centralized system has gone down. So just wanted to say that.
Yeah. And yeah, we just got to make sure that everyone's building is still part of these conversations and they don't go off into their own silos and then get devoid of that thinking. But no, I agree with you there.
It seems to be. It seems that there's a willingness to go there, to go into uncertainty, to go into we know that things go wrong. We cannot avoid that, but we're going to make sure that they don't lead to dystopia. So, but Eugene, you can go on.
Yeah.
You can put Joshua on the spot now.
Yeah,
It's
so I
your
guess in
turn.
a similar vein, because the one that adds a lot of that I still have least clarity on in my mind, both in positive and negative, is like, what is the actual DeSci future of drug development? So yeah, I would be interested if you have any particular thoughts on how you could see drug development going off the rails in a
Going off the
decentralized
rails.
fashion.
Oh God. Yeah. Okay. So like, obviously, drug development has many different stages. You've got the early stage research. You've got the next stage research. You've got the getting it to production and then getting it to market, getting it past regulators. For me, I think this is going to be a cop out because it is, but I'm going to go a bit deeper on it. But for me, the worst thing would be for DeSci drug development DAOs to end up basically the situation that DeFi is in right now, which is to basically have to change the product so that it fits with the regulatory environment. The drug development DAOs that will be springing up ad nauseum, I'm sure, in the next years, they will have to adhere to some kind of like sovereign regulatory environment for drugs, and that is in many ways a necessity. But also, what are we trying to do here, right? You know, for example, right, some of the things that we've experienced in the past 3 years have been at the behest of regulatory oversight, right? Such as your NIHs, your CDCs, your WHOs. In the UK, we have SAGE, all these kinds of things, right? What are we trying to do here? Are we trying to basically just change the gains for the scientists and change the game for like the corporatism of science, or are we trying to change the game for how basically we interact with healthcare, how we interact with each other, how we interact with research, how we interact with the paradigm of healing yourself? I want to smoke a joint because it heals my back. I can't do so in most countries in the world, right? This is the point. It's like we're trying to build these alternative systems, but we have to somehow embed them into the existing systems. So for me, one of the worst things that could actually happen to a drug development DAO would be for it to have to adhere itself to the existing system, which isn't serving the people. It's certainly not serving the people that consume these drugs. I mean, look at the opioid crisis in the US and in other places in the world, right? Someone in the DeSci World team, I'm not going to mention, but he has an injury, a very severe one, and he's been failed by the drug development system. He's been failed by the treatment system for most of his life, right? For at least a decade and a bit. And it's like, what are we trying to do? Are we trying to sort of solve each individual point? Are we just trying to make it more efficient? Are we trying to give more money back to the developers, to the scientists? All good things. But how do we fit into this regulatory framework, especially when it comes to something like drug development? Something to think about. I personally would be devastated if we just changed the manufacturing process, made that more equitable, but the actual oversight, the actual sort of regulatory, the legal situation that we are in with medicine and science, if that stayed, I would be devastated. So that's, for me, the worst case.
And I think that brings up some really interesting fodder of, right? Because I know in this Web3 space, we have some wonderfully hardcore libertarians for whom the word regulation is just equivalent to just like murder of children and whatnot. Like, I don't fall in that camp. Like sometimes
Me
you
neither,
need,
disclaimer.
yeah,
I think there should be
some kind of oversight, right? Whether a government should be the one in overseeing is a whole separate topic. And so like what I pulled out from what you were saying and like gets me excited is a really interesting question that I hope we all ask in some way is, well, what is the decentralized alternative to regulation, right? We're not saying that you either do have everything hyper-regulated or no regulation at all. How do we fundamentally rethink who gets to, right? You were saying like, what is the point of this? What are we actually doing here? Who decides that is such a key question. Like that is one of the biggest concentrations of power in modern societies is who answers those kinds of questions of what is the point of this? Why are we all doing insert massive societal question, right? And yeah, it's just like we should at least be having these conversations and also hopefully not why I appreciate these conversations so much is like there isn't that braggadociousness of like, and I have the. It's like, well, no, we all have our thoughts and leanings, but like let's all experiment together, and hopefully we'll take steps in that right direction. So yeah, the idea of like how do you actually create meaningful, emergent, self-regulatory models within ecosystems, I think is such an important governance question that would actually be a huge unlock for stepping away from the modern broken systems, because a lot of the pushback is around, well, like who will regulate, right? Like it's all going to go off the rails and the rich people will drive it where they want and all the, all the sheeple will just follow them and they don't know any, right? Like if there's actually proven out emergent self-regulatory models, I feel like there's a fundamentally different discussions that get to be had on a very meaningful scale.
My 2 cents. Let's take a closer look at biology, because it has been doing that for centuries now, for millions of years. But it seems like we're heading to a close. Although we started a bit later, so I will leave a bit of space. Oh no! No worries. It's on us. So I will leave a bit more time, maybe 2 or 3 minutes. If you have any closing remarks, anything that you want to give a shout out to, your own projects, your own endeavors, anything that you want to still, you're free to do this.
Josh, do you want to show first or should I show away and then pass on? Thank you. So yeah, I mean, yeah, obviously SCRF, smartcontractresearch.org, smart contract, whatever, you get it. You can find us online. Come talk to me if you ever want to talk SCRF stuff. I do also just want to plug, there's so many great projects. Obviously, Josh is here from DeSci World. We had Ariella presenting on women in Web3 and science. And like, there's so many amazing projects going on. If you're interested in this intersection of Web3 and science, Twitter, obviously all of Web3, Twitter's active. Check it out. There's a bunch of groups ranging from, the Molecule Vita DAO, Lab DAO family, and like they're going in a specific direction of experimentation. There's the research hubs, there's the DeSci labs, DeSci foundations. There's all these amazing landscape of different kind of projects going on. I know just at the I had another conversation today, and all of a sudden my list of projects actively working at the intersection of peer review and Web3 went from 9 to 10. And it's always amazing how many groups there are in these tiny, narrow pockets. So yeah, and if you do want to actually get involved, there's a bunch of needs on the community side on kind of bridge building across these organizations. Like if you care about science and you care about Web3 and you want to be part of this, there's a great Telegram group we can share. Blockchain for Science runs an awesome Telegram group. They're launching a DeSci dedicated forum, right? Like this is super early days for DeSci. For those who have lived through the DeFi stuff, like I really think this is like the equivalent of being in 17, 18, 19 for DeFi. Like we are just going to start seeing this come through in the next bull run, which might be 3 to 5 years away. So like now's the time where if you want to have impact, head down, build, come hang out. Like there's so many good people in this space.
Amen. And Joshua?
Yeah, amen to that. There is a lot of stuff to look for in this space. So I'm going to show DeSci World for that very purpose. The idea of DeSci World, aside from the community infrastructure that I said, is that we're actually offering free to use platform for basically information aggregation for this whole space. Our official relaunch is July 1st. So you can check out our currently sort of half done staging site at DeSci.world. It's a nice little taste of what it will come to look like. July 1st, please stay tuned to our Twitter at DeSci World, and join our Discord and get involved, because there's lots of really exciting things to come. If you are looking to sort of be incentivized to be in this space as well, come and take a look. You might find something of interest. Yeah, I just want to say thank you to MetaFest, and it's always good to speak with you, Eugene. So yeah, thank you.
Likewise. And I realized I forgot to plug Dr. Jocelyn Pearl's Ultra Rare Bio podcast. They actually focus on DeSci episodes. So if you do want to learn more about the different projects, check out Ultra Rare. And yeah, thank you all for MetaFest. Thank you, Unico, for setting this up, and to everyone else who helped make this virtual conference happen.
Yeah, thank you for being here and sharing this wonderful ideas. So this was the DeSci panel, everybody. Hope to see you around, and peace out.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye.